The morning sun cast long shadows across the rugged terrain of New Mexico Territory as James McKenna guided his horse along the rocky canyon walls. It was 1861, and the frontier was a dangerous place where Apache raids had become increasingly common. McKenna, a seasoned scout and trader, knew these lands better than most white men. His weathered hands gripped the reins as he navigated the treacherous path, always alert for signs of danger. McKenna had been tracking a group of stolen cattle for 3 days when he noticed something unusual. Fresh footprints led away from the main trail toward a series of limestone caves hidden deep in the canyon. The prints were small, definitely not from the cattle thieves he was pursuing. His curiosity piqued. He dismounted and tied his horse to a sturdy juniper tree before approaching the cave entrance on foot. The cave mouth was partially concealed by fallen rocks and thick brush, making it nearly invisible to casual observers. As McKenna pushed aside the vegetation, he heard something that made his blood run cold: the soft sound of crying. It was unmistakably human, and it sounded like children. His heart began to race as he considered the possibilities. Were these survivors of a recent raid, lost travelers, or something far more sinister? Drawing his rifle, McKenna carefully stepped into the cool darkness of the cave. The crying grew louder, echoing off the stone walls. As his eyes adjusted to the dim light filtering in from the entrance, he could make out 2 small figures huddled together in the far corner of the cave. They were young Apache girls, probably no more than 12 or 13 years old, their traditional clothing torn and dirty. The girls shrank back in terror when they saw the armed white man approaching. They spoke rapidly in Apache, their voices filled with fear and desperation. McKenna recognized some of the words from his years trading with various tribes. They were pleading, asking him not to hurt them. Their wrists bore the marks of rope burns, and it was clear they had been held captive for some time. McKenna slowly lowered his weapon and raised his hands to show he meant no harm. He spoke the few Apache words he knew, trying to calm the frightened sisters. Gradually, he pieced together their story through broken English mixed with Apache phrases. The girls were Ayanna and Itzel, daughters of a respected Apache chief named Nalnish. They had been captured during a raid on their village 3 weeks earlier by a group of Mexican slavers who planned to sell them in the markets of Santa Fe. The slavers had hidden the girls in this remote cave while they conducted other business in the area. They had left minimal food and water, keeping the sisters weak and unable to escape. The rope marks on their wrists told of desperate attempts to free themselves from their bonds. They had managed to work loose from their restraints only the day before McKenna found them, but were too afraid and disoriented to venture out of the cave alone. As McKenna listened to their story, he felt a deep anger building inside him. The slave trade was still active in this part of the territory, despite official efforts to stop it. Mexican and American traders regularly captured Apache children to sell as domestic servants or worse. The practice had been going on for decades, creating deep hatred between the Apache people and white settlers. McKenna faced a difficult decision. He could simply walk away and pretend he had never found the girls. That would be the safe choice for a white man in Apache territory. Alternatively, he could try to help them, but that would mean getting involved in something that could easily cost him his life. The Apache were known to shoot first and ask questions later when it came to white men found with their children. The 2 sisters looked at him with desperate hope in their dark eyes. They had been through unimaginable trauma, torn from their families and held captive by men who saw them as nothing more than valuable merchandise. McKenna knew that if he left them here, the slavers would eventually return to collect their property. The girls would disappear into a life of servitude, never to see their family again. Despite the danger to himself, McKenna made his choice. He would help the sisters return to their people. Little did he know that this decision would set in motion a chain of events that would escalate tensions between the Apache and white settlers to a breaking point. His act of mercy would be misinterpreted, leading to one of the most violent conflicts in the history of the American Southwest. The girls cautiously accepted his help, though fear remained evident in their eyes. McKenna shared his water and what little food he had with them, trying to build their strength for the journey ahead. He knew that getting them back to their tribe would be incredibly dangerous. Apache warriors were constantly patrolling their territory, and they would not hesitate to kill any white man they found, regardless of his intentions. As the afternoon wore on, McKenna prepared for what might be the most perilous mission of his life. He had to find a way to safely return Ayanna and Itzel to their father, without getting himself killed in the process. The irony was not lost on him that doing the right thing might very well trigger the exact kind of violence he was trying to prevent. McKenna spent the night in the cave with the two Apache sisters, taking turns keeping watch while they slept fitfully. The girls had been surviving on scraps of dried meat and muddy water for weeks, and their weakened condition worried him greatly. Ayanna, the older sister, had developed a persistent cough, while Itzel could barely walk without assistance. He knew they needed proper food and medical attention, but getting help meant revealing their presence to others. At dawn, McKenna made a crucial decision that would later prove fateful. Rather than attempting the dangerous journey to Apache territory immediately, he decided to take the girls to the nearest settlement, a small trading post called Cedar Springs, about 15 miles south of their location. He reasoned that the girls needed time to recover their strength, and he could gather information about Apache movements in the area before attempting to return them to their tribe. The journey to Cedar Springs was arduous. McKenna fashioned a makeshift travois from branches and his bedroll to carry Itzel, who was too weak to ride. Ayanna managed to sit on his horse, though she swayed dangerously with exhaustion. Every few hours, they had to stop for rest, and McKenna found himself constantly scanning the horizon for signs of pursuit. The slavers could return to the cave at any time and discover their captives were missing. When they finally reached Cedar Springs, the small community was buzzing with tension. Recent Apache raids had everyone on edge, and the sight of McKenna, arriving with two Apache children, immediately drew suspicious stares. The trading post owner, a gruff man named Samuel Morrison, pulled McKenna aside with urgent concern written across his weathered face. Morrison explained that just 2 days earlier, a large Apache war party led by Chief Nalnish himself had attacked a supply wagon only 10 miles from the settlement. 3 teamsters had been killed, and the Apache had made off with weapons and ammunition. The territorial governor had already been notified, and military reinforcements were expected within the week. The timing could not have been worse for McKenna's rescue mission. Despite the dangerous situation, McKenna decided to trust Morrison with the truth. He explained how he had found the girls and his intention to return them to their people. Morrison listened with growing alarm, his face pale with the implications of what McKenna was telling him. The presence of Chief Nalnish's daughters in their settlement could be seen as an act of war by the Apache, regardless of McKenna's good intentions. Morrison's wife, Martha, took immediate charge of caring for the girls, despite her husband's protests. She cleaned their wounds, fed them hot soup, and provided them with clean clothes. The sisters remained wary of the white settlers, but hunger and exhaustion overcame their fear. As they recovered some strength, they began to speak more freely about their ordeal and their desperate desire to return home. Through broken conversations with Ayanna, who spoke some English learned from missionary contacts, McKenna learned more about the political situation he had stumbled into. Chief Nalnish was one of the most respected war leaders among the Apache, bands known for his strategic brilliance and fierce protection of his people. The recent increase in Apache attacks was directly related to the growing slave trade and encroachment on traditional Apache lands. The girls revealed that their capture had not been random. The Mexican slavers had specifically targeted them because of their father's status. They planned to use the sisters as bargaining chips in negotiations with Apache leaders, or sell them for an enormous price to collectors who prized the children of famous chiefs. Their disappearance had already driven Chief Nalnish into a rage that was spreading throughout the Apache Confederation. Word of the girls' presence in Cedar Springs began to spread despite McKenna's attempts at secrecy. Some settlers demanded that they be turned over to military authorities as enemy combatants. Others argued they should be used as hostages to ensure Apache cooperation in upcoming peace negotiations. A few sympathetic voices supported McKenna's plan to return them, but they were vastly outnumbered. The situation became more complicated when a Mexican trader named Carlos Mendez arrived at the settlement. McKenna immediately recognized him as one of the men whose tracks he had been following before discovering the cave. Mendez began asking questions about missing Apache children claiming they were his property that had been stolen from him. His presence confirmed McKenna's worst fears about the girls' original captors. That evening, a heated town meeting was called to decide what to do with Ayanna and Itzel. The small community was deeply divided, with practical concerns about their safety conflicting with moral questions about the right course of action. McKenna found himself defending his decision to help the girls against neighbors who saw them as nothing more than dangerous complications to be disposed of quickly. During the meeting, a young boy burst in with terrifying news. Apache smoke signals had been spotted on the distant mesas, and scouts reported a large war party moving toward their area. The timing was too coincidental to ignore. Chief Nalnish was searching for his daughters, and his warriors were getting closer to Cedar Springs with each passing hour. As panic began to set in among the settlers, McKenna realized that his attempt to help two innocent children had inadvertently placed an entire community in mortal danger. The Apache would not distinguish between those who had helped his daughters and those who had merely harbored them. In their eyes, all white settlers were potential enemies who might have been involved in the girls' captivity. McKenna faced an impossible choice. He could try to slip away with the girls under cover of darkness, hoping to reach the Apache and explain the situation before violence erupted. Or he could stay and help the settlement prepare for what seemed like an inevitable attack. Either way, his decision to rescue Ayanna and Itzel from the cave was about to have consequences far beyond anything he had imagined. The tension in Cedar Springs reached a breaking point when Carlos Mendez openly accused McKenna of stealing his merchandise. The Mexican trader had gathered a small group of rough-looking men who claimed they had legal papers showing ownership of the Apache girls. Mendez demanded that the sisters be returned to him immediately, threatening to involve territorial authorities if the settlers interfered with his property rights. McKenna's blood boiled as he listened to Mendez speak about Ayanna and Itzel as if they were livestock. The trader's arrogance was matched only by his apparent ignorance of the explosive situation developing around them. Apache smoke signals continued to appear on the surrounding hills, growing closer each day, and scouts reported increasing warrior activity throughout the region. The girls themselves became terrified when they saw Mendez, confirming McKenna's suspicions about their original captors. Ayanna whispered urgently to her sister in Apache before approaching McKenna with desperate eyes. In broken English, she explained that Mendez was the leader of the slavers who had destroyed their village and captured them. She begged McKenna not to let the Mexican take them again. Samuel Morrison tried to maintain neutrality, but his wife Martha had no such reservations. She stood between the girls and Mendez, declaring that no children would be handed over to slavers while she drew breath. Her defiance inspired other women in the settlement, creating a surprising coalition of protection around Ayanna and Itzel. The community found itself splitting along unexpected lines. During this standoff, a new complication emerged. A cavalry patrol led by Lieutenant William Hayes arrived at Cedar Springs, having been dispatched to investigate the recent Apache attacks. Hayes was a young officer, fresh from West Point, with little experience in dealing with the complex realities of frontier life. His arrival changed the entire dynamic of the situation. Lieutenant Hayes immediately took charge, declaring that the Apache girls were now under military protection, pending investigation of their status. This infuriated Mendez, who produced what appeared to be official papers documenting his ownership rights. However, Hayes was suspicious of the documents and announced that he would need to verify their authenticity with his superiors before taking any action. The military presence gave McKenna some relief, but he soon realized that Hayes had no understanding of Apache culture or the delicate nature of their situation. The lieutenant saw the girls as potential intelligence assets who might provide information about Apache military plans. He began questioning them about their father's warriors and tribal movements, not understanding that such interrogation would be seen as preparation for war by any Apache who learned of it. Meanwhile, the Apache signals were getting closer and more frequent. Local Apache-speaking traders interpreted the smoke messages as increasingly urgent searches for the missing daughters of Chief Nalnish. The war party was methodically checking every settlement and camp in the territory, and Cedar Springs was directly in their path. McKenna tried to explain the cultural implications to Lieutenant Hayes, but the young officer dismissed his concerns as frontier superstition. Hayes believed that proper military discipline and superior weapons would be sufficient to handle any Apache threat. He ordered his men to prepare defensive positions around the settlement and sent messages requesting additional troops. The situation deteriorated further when one of Hayes's soldiers, Private Jake Murphy, recognized Ayanna from a previous encounter. Murphy had been present during a failed peace negotiation several months earlier, where Chief Nalnish had brought his older daughter to demonstrate his good faith. The private's identification confirmed the girl's royal status among the Apache and raised the stakes exponentially. News of the girl's identity spread quickly through the patrol, and several soldiers began to see them as valuable bargaining chips. They discussed using the sisters as leverage to force Apache compliance with territorial demands, or as human shields if attacked. McKenna was horrified by these conversations and began to fear that the military presence was making the situation worse rather than better. That night, Ayanna approached McKenna with a desperate proposal. She had been watching the white men argue over their fate and understood that neither the soldiers nor the Mexican trader had any intention of safely returning them to their people. She asked McKenna to help them escape during the darkness and guide them toward the Apache search parties. The older sister explained that she and Itzel could signal their father's warriors once they were free of the settlement, preventing an attack on Cedar Springs. However, she warned McKenna that any white man found with them would likely be killed immediately, as Apache warriors would assume he was another slaver trying to escape with their prize. McKenna spent sleepless hours wrestling with this new dilemma. Helping the girls escape would mean abandoning his neighbors to face potential Apache wrath alone, but keeping them in Cedar Springs seemed to guarantee violence. The military's aggressive preparations were being interpreted as hostile actions by Apache scouts, and Lieutenant Hayes's interrogations were being seen as torture of captured children. The next morning brought news that changed everything. A lone Apache rider appeared on a hill overlooking the settlement, carrying a white flag of truce. The warrior sat motionless on his horse for several minutes before slowly approaching the settlement's outskirts. Lieutenant Hayes immediately ordered his men to defensive positions, interpreting the approach as a potential attack. McKenna recognized the significance of the Apache's actions and tried to convince Hayes to allow negotiations, but the lieutenant refused to deal with what he called savage demands. The miscommunication between military protocol and Apache diplomatic customs created another layer of dangerous misunderstanding. The Apache messenger called out in English, demanding to speak with whoever held the daughters of Chief Nalnish. His presence confirmed what everyone had feared. The war party had found them. The choices made in the next few hours would determine whether Cedar Springs became the site of a peaceful reunion or a bloody massacre. As McKenna watched the standoff develop, he realized that his simple act of rescuing two frightened children from a cave had evolved into a complex political crisis involving military authorities, Mexican slavers, terrified settlers, and increasingly angry Apache warriors. The threads of conflict were drawing tighter, and violence seemed almost inevitable. Standing in the deadly no-man's land between Apache warriors and U.S. soldiers, McKenna raised both hands high above his head and began walking slowly toward Daklugi. Apache arrows were nocked and ready while rifles were trained on targets from both directions. The slightest wrong move would unleash a storm of violence that would leave dozens dead within minutes. McKenna shouted in his broken Apache in English, addressing both sides simultaneously. He declared that he was the man who had found the chief's daughters and that he would personally guarantee their safe return. His voice carried across the tense silence, and gradually the sounds of weapons being prepared for battle began to subside. Daklugi studied McKenna carefully, recognizing something in the white man's bearing that suggested honor rather than deception. The Apache warrior had heard stories about McKenna from other tribes. He was known as a fair trader who had never broken his word. This reputation now became crucial as it provided a foundation for trust in an otherwise impossible situation. Behind the barricades, Lieutenant Hayes was furious at McKenna's unauthorized negotiation, but he was also pragmatic enough to recognize that the settler might be their only hope for avoiding annihilation. The young officer held his fire while watching the drama unfold, ready to either support McKenna's efforts or avenge his death. The breakthrough came when Ayanna called out to her cousin in Apache, explaining that McKenna was the one who had saved them from the cave and protected them from the slavers. Her words carried across the settlement, and their effect on Daklugi was immediate and visible. The rigid tension in his posture relaxed slightly, and he responded to his cousin with obvious relief and gratitude. McKenna seized this moment of reduced hostility to propose a formal exchange. He would personally escort both girls to Daklugi, accompanied only by Martha Morrison to verify their medical condition. In return, the Apache would allow all settlers and soldiers safe passage away from Cedar Springs if they chose to leave. It was a reasonable compromise that addressed everyone's primary concerns. However, Carlos Mendez refused to accept the proposed solution, continuing to insist on his legal rights to the children. His stubborn greed threatened to derail the fragile negotiations just when peace seemed possible. Several settlers turned on the Mexican trader with open hostility, blaming him for creating the crisis that now endangered their lives. The confrontation with Mendez reached a climax when Samuel Morrison finally lost his temper. The trading post owner had been trying to maintain neutrality, but watching the slavers' continued attempts to claim ownership of traumatized children pushed him past his breaking point. Morrison physically threw Mendez out of the negotiations, declaring that his establishment would no longer serve anyone involved in the slave trade. With Mendez temporarily neutralized, McKenna was able to proceed with the exchange arrangements. Martha Morrison gathered medical supplies and blankets for the girls' journey home, while Ayana helped support her weakening sister. Eitzel's condition had deteriorated noticeably during the standoff, adding urgency to the need for resolution. The actual exchange took place in the open ground between the settlement and Daklugi's position. McKenna walked slowly forward with the two sisters, Martha Morrison beside them carrying medical supplies. The tension was overwhelming as dozens of weapons remained trained on the small group, but gradually it became clear that the exchange would proceed peacefully. When Daklugi finally embraced his cousins, the emotional reunion was visible to everyone present. The Apache warrior's tears of relief demonstrated the deep family bonds that had driven his people's desperate search. For many of the watching settlers, it was the first time they had witnessed Apache humanity, rather than just their reputation as fierce warriors. However, the successful exchange of the children did not immediately resolve the larger crisis. Chief Nalnish's war party remained in the area, and their presence continued to threaten other settlements throughout the region. The girls' safe return had prevented immediate violence, but it had also revealed the extent of Apache military preparation and their determination to protect their people. Lieutenant Hayes found himself in an impossible position. His orders were to maintain peace in the territory, but he had just witnessed clear evidence of a large Apache force that could threaten every settlement for miles around. Military protocol demanded that he report this intelligence to his superiors, potentially triggering a larger military response. The aftermath of the exchange created new complications as news of the incident spread throughout the territory. Some communities praised McKenna's intervention as heroic, while others condemned it as dangerous meddling that had exposed Apache military capabilities. The territorial governor demanded full reports from all involved parties, setting the stage for official investigations. Carlos Mendez, having been denied his claimed property, began spreading a different version of events. He portrayed himself as a legitimate businessman who had been robbed by Apache sympathizers and military incompetence. His accusations gained traction among those who profited from the slave trade and viewed any cooperation with Apache people as treasonous. The Mexican trader's propaganda campaign was designed to justify retaliation against both the Apache and their white allies. He claimed that McKenna's actions had encouraged Apache aggression, and that the successful rescue had made future raids more likely. These arguments resonated with settlers who feared Apache reprisals and wanted military protection. Meanwhile, Chief Nalnish's reaction to his daughter's return was complex and far-reaching. While he was grateful for their safe recovery, the ordeal had demonstrated the continuing threat posed by slavers and the inability of U.S. authorities to prevent such crimes. His war council began planning responses that would discourage future attempts to capture Apache children. The chief's strategic thinking went beyond immediate retaliation. He recognized that the incident at Cedar Springs had created an opportunity to send a message about Apache determination to protect their families. The successful rescue had also revealed potential allies among the white population information that could prove valuable in future conflicts. As McKenna returned to his normal life, he began to understand that his rescue of Ayanna and Itzel had changed the political landscape of the entire region. What had seemed like a simple act of human decency had become a catalyst for much larger forces of conflict and cooperation. The true consequences of his decision were only beginning to unfold. Standing in the deadly no-man's land between Apache warriors and U.S. soldiers, McKenna raised both hands high above his head and began walking slowly toward Daklugi. Apache arrows were nocked and ready, while rifles were trained on targets from both directions. The slightest wrong move would unleash a storm of violence that would leave dozens dead within minutes. McKenna shouted in his broken Apache in English, addressing both sides simultaneously. He declared that he was the man who had found the chief's daughters, and that he would personally guarantee their safe return. His voice carried across the tense silence, and gradually the sounds of weapons being prepared for battle began to subside. Daklugi studied McKenna carefully, recognizing something in the white man's bearing that suggested honor rather than deception. The Apache warrior had heard stories about McKenna from other tribes. He was known as a fair trader who had never broken his word. This reputation now became crucial as it provided a foundation for trust in an otherwise impossible situation. Behind the barricades, Lieutenant Hayes was furious at McKenna's unauthorized negotiation, but he was also pragmatic enough to recognize that the settler might be their only hope for avoiding annihilation. The young officer held his fire while watching the drama unfold, ready to either support McKenna's efforts or avenge his death. The breakthrough came when Ayanna called out to her cousin in Apache, explaining that McKenna was the one who had saved them from the cave and protected them from the slavers. Her words carried across the settlement, and their effect on Daklugi was immediate and visible. The rigid tension in his posture relaxed slightly, and he responded to his cousin with obvious relief and gratitude. McKenna seized this moment of reduced hostility to propose a formal exchange. He would personally escort both girls to Daklugi, accompanied only by Martha Morrison to verify their medical condition. In return, the Apache would allow all settlers and soldiers safe passage away from Cedar Springs if they chose to leave. It was a reasonable compromise that addressed everyone's primary concerns. However, Carlos Mendez refused to accept the proposed solution, continuing to insist on his legal rights to the children. His stubborn greed threatened to derail the fragile negotiations just when peace seemed possible. Several settlers turned on the Mexican trader with open hostility, blaming him for creating the crisis that now endangered their lives. The confrontation with Mendez reached a climax when Samuel Morrison finally lost his temper. The trading post owner had been trying to maintain neutrality, but watching the slavers' continued attempts to claim ownership of traumatized children pushed him past his breaking point. Morrison physically threw Mendez out of the negotiations, declaring that his establishment would no longer serve anyone involved in the slave trade. With Mendez temporarily neutralized, McKenna was able to proceed with the exchange arrangements. Martha Morrison gathered medical supplies and blankets for the girls' journey home, while Ayanna helped support her weakening sister. Itzel's condition had deteriorated noticeably during the standoff, adding urgency to the need for resolution. The actual exchange took place in the open ground between the settlement and Daklugi's position. McKenna walked slowly forward with the two sisters, Martha Morrison beside them carrying medical supplies. The tension was overwhelming as dozens of weapons remained trained on the small group, but gradually it became clear that the exchange would proceed peacefully. When Daklugi finally embraced his cousins, the emotional reunion was visible to everyone present. The Apache warrior's tears of relief demonstrated the deep family bonds that had driven his people's desperate search. For many of the watching settlers, it was the first time they had witnessed Apache humanity rather than just their reputation as fierce warriors. However, the successful exchange of the children did not immediately resolve the larger crisis. Chief Nalnish's war party remained in the area, and their presence continued to threaten other settlements throughout the region. The girls' safe return had prevented immediate violence, but it had also revealed the extent of Apache military preparation and their determination to protect their people. Lieutenant Hayes found himself in an impossible position. His orders were to maintain peace in the territory, but he had just witnessed clear evidence of a large Apache force that could threaten every settlement for miles around. Military protocol demanded that he report this intelligence to his superiors, potentially triggering a larger military response. The aftermath of the exchange created new complications as news of the incident spread throughout the territory. Some communities praised McKenna's intervention as heroic, while others condemned it as dangerous meddling that had exposed Apache military capabilities. The territorial governor demanded full reports from all involved parties, setting the stage for official investigations. Carlos Mendez, having been denied his claimed property, began spreading a different version of events. He portrayed himself as a legitimate businessman who had been robbed by Apache sympathizers and military incompetence. His accusations gained traction among those who profited from the slave trade and viewed any cooperation with Apache people as treasonous. The Mexican traders' propaganda campaign was designed to justify retaliation against both the Apache and their white allies. He claimed that McKenna's actions had encouraged Apache aggression and that the successful rescue had made future raids more likely. These arguments resonated with settlers who feared Apache reprisals and wanted military protection. Meanwhile, Chief Nalnish's reaction to his daughter's return was complex and far-reaching. While he was grateful for their safe recovery, the ordeal had demonstrated the continuing threat posed by slavers and the inability of U.S. authorities to prevent such crimes. His war council began planning responses that would discourage future attempts to capture Apache children. The chief's strategic thinking went beyond immediate retaliation. He recognized that the incident at Cedar Springs had created an opportunity to send a message about Apache determination to protect their families. The successful rescue had also revealed potential allies among the white population, information that could prove valuable in future conflicts. As McKenna returned to his normal life, he began to understand that his rescue of Ayanna and Itzel had changed the political landscape of the entire region. What had seemed like a simple act of human decency had become a catalyst for much larger forces of conflict and cooperation. The true consequences of his decision were only beginning to unfold. 3 weeks after the successful exchange at Cedar Springs, the fragile peace began to unravel as both sides prepared for what seemed like inevitable conflict. Chief Nalnish had used the time to consolidate his forces and form alliances with other Apache bands who shared his concerns about the growing slave trade. The rescue of his daughters had become a rallying point for broader Apache resistance to territorial encroachment. McKenna found himself caught in the middle of escalating tensions as both Apache and white communities sought to claim him as an ally. Apache messengers brought gifts from Chief Nalnish, expressing gratitude for his protection of Ayanna and Itzel, while territorial authorities questioned his loyalties and suggested he might be providing intelligence to hostile forces. The situation deteriorated rapidly when Carlos Mendez organized a group of Mexican and American traders who had been profiting from the slave trade. Calling themselves the Territory Protection Association, they demanded military action against Apache bands they claimed were planning coordinated attacks on settlements. Mendez used his version of the Cedar Springs incident as evidence of Apache aggression and white collaboration with enemies. Lieutenant Hayes, still smarting from his humiliation during the prisoner exchange, submitted reports that emphasized Apache military strength and their potential threat to territorial security. His superiors interpreted these reports as justification for preventive military action, and additional cavalry units were dispatched to the region with orders to demonstrate American authority. The military buildup did not go unnoticed by Apache scouts, who reported the troop movements to their war councils. Chief Nalnish interpreted the increased military presence as preparation for attacks on Apache villages, possibly including attempts to recapture his daughters. His response was to accelerate his own military preparations and seek additional allies among neighboring tribes. The crisis escalated when a supply convoy bound for the new military garrison was attacked by Apache raiders near Copper Canyon, only 40 miles from Cedar Springs. 3 soldiers were killed and significant amounts of weapons and ammunition were captured. The attack bore the tactical hallmarks of Chief Nalnish's forces, though no definitive proof of his involvement was ever established. News of the convoy attack spread panic throughout the territory's white settlements. Communities that had remained neutral in the growing dispute between Apache forces and territorial authorities suddenly demanded military protection. The territorial governor declared a state of emergency and authorized expanded military operations against hostile Apache bands. McKenna watched these developments with growing dread, realizing that his rescue of the two sisters had become a symbolic flashpoint for much larger conflicts. Apache leaders pointed to his actions as proof that some whites could be trusted and were willing to risk themselves for Apache children. Conversely, territorial authorities saw the same actions as dangerous precedents that encouraged Apache resistance. The breaking point came when Carlos Mendez led a raid on a small Apache camp near the Mexican border, claiming he was recovering stolen property and pursuing slavers who had attacked his trading operation. In reality, Mendez was seeking revenge for his losses at Cedar Springs and attempting to recapture Apache children for his slave trade network. The raid was a disaster for Mendez and his followers. The Apache camp was actually a decoy set up by Chief Nalnish's warriors, who had anticipated such an attack. When Mendez's force entered the camp, they found themselves surrounded by hidden Apache fighters who had been waiting in ambush positions throughout the surrounding hills. Only 3 members of Mendez's raiding party survived to escape and report what had happened. Their description of the Apache tactical coordination and the presence of weapons clearly taken from the military convoy convinced territorial authorities that they were facing a well-organized enemy force rather than random raiding bands. Chief Nalnish made his position clear through a message sent to territorial headquarters via McKenna, whom he still trusted as an honest intermediary. The Apache leader declared that his people would defend themselves against any attempts at enslavement or forced relocation, but he also expressed continued gratitude for McKenna's protection of his daughters and indicated willingness to negotiate peace with honorable white leaders. However, the territorial governor had already committed to a military solution. Orders went out to all cavalry units in the region to begin coordinated operations against Apache strongholds, with particular emphasis on capturing or eliminating Chief Nalnish and his war council. The goal was to demonstrate that resistance to territorial authority would not be tolerated. McKenna found himself in an impossible position as both sides sought to use him as a communication channel while simultaneously preparing for war. Apache messengers brought him detailed intelligence about military movements, expecting him to warn white settlements about impending attacks. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Hayes demanded that he report all Apache contacts to military authorities. The final diplomatic effort came when McKenna arranged a meeting between territorial representatives and Apache leaders at a neutral location near the original cave where he had found Ayana and Itzel. Both sides agreed to the meeting, but their objectives were fundamentally incompatible, making genuine compromise nearly impossible. Chief Nalnish attended the meeting with a small delegation that included his daughters, who had recovered from their ordeal and wanted to thank McKenna personally. The Apache leaders' demands were straightforward: an end to slave raids on Apache communities, recognition of traditional Apache territories, and punishment of traitors like Carlos Mendez who had been preying on Apache children. The territorial representatives, led by Colonel James Patterson, offered limited concessions regarding slave trading, but insisted that Apache bands submit to territorial authority and relocate to designated reservations. These terms were completely unacceptable to Chief Nalnish, who viewed them as another form of imprisonment for his people. The meeting deteriorated quickly when Colonel Patterson suggested that the Apache should be grateful for territorial protection rather than making demands of their own. He pointed out that military forces were now strong enough to enforce compliance whether the Apache cooperated or not. This veiled threat infuriated Chief Nalnish, who saw it as confirmation that whites viewed negotiations as opportunities to deliver ultimatums rather than reach genuine agreements. Ayana and Itzel watched the proceedings with growing sadness, understanding that the goodwill created by their rescue was being destroyed by political forces beyond anyone's control. They had hoped that their father and McKenna could find a path to peace, but the gulf between Apache and territorial positions seemed unbridgeable. The diplomatic failure at the cave meeting marked the end of peaceful options for resolving the crisis. Within days of the failed negotiations, both sides began preparing for sustained military conflict. Chief Nalnish sent messengers to Apache bands throughout the Southwest, calling for a coordinated response to territorial aggression. McKenna realized that his rescue of two frightened children from a cave had set in motion events that would soon engulf the entire region in warfare. The irony was devastating. His act of compassion had become the catalyst for exactly the kind of violence he had hoped to prevent. The stage was now set for a conflict that would determine the future of Apache resistance and territorial expansion in the American Southwest. The war that erupted across the New Mexico Territory in the summer of 1861 became known as the Nalnish Uprising, named after the Apache chief whose daughter's rescue had inadvertently triggered the conflict. What began as McKenna's simple act of mercy had evolved into one of the most significant Apache resistance movements in southwestern history. Chief Nalnish proved to be a formidable military strategist, using the intelligence gathered during the Cedar Springs incident to launch coordinated attacks on military supply lines and isolated settlements. His forces avoided direct confrontation with large military units, instead focusing on guerrilla tactics that disrupted territorial operations while minimizing Apache casualties. The war's early phase saw remarkable Apache success as Chief Nalnish's confederation grew to include bands that had previously remained neutral. The rescue of his daughters had demonstrated that some whites could be trusted, while the territorial government's aggressive response proved that cooperation was impossible. This combination drove previously moderate Apache leaders into the resistance coalition. McKenna found himself in an increasingly dangerous position as the conflict intensified. Both sides viewed him with suspicion. Apache warriors who didn't know him personally saw him as a potential spy, while territorial authorities considered him a traitor for his continued communication with Chief Nalnish. His home near Cedar Springs became a target for raids from both directions. The turning point came when Colonel Patterson decided to use McKenna as bait to capture Chief Nalnish. The military commander spread rumors that McKenna had important information about Apache movements and needed urgent protection at a remote outpost. The plan was to ambush any Apache force that came to rescue their white ally. However, Chief Nalnish was too experienced to fall for such obvious deception. Instead of attempting a rescue, he sent a message warning McKenna about the trap and offering him sanctuary in Apache territory. The chief's continued trust and protection of the man who had saved his daughters demonstrated the depth of Apache gratitude and honor. McKenna faced an agonizing decision about accepting the Apache offer of protection. Joining Chief Nalnish would mean abandoning his home and becoming a permanent exile from white society. However, remaining in territorial areas increasingly meant risking capture or death from both military forces and Mexican slavers seeking revenge. The crisis deepened when Lieutenant Hayes, seeking redemption for his earlier failures, launched an unauthorized attack on an Apache camp where he believed McKenna was hiding. The assault was a catastrophic mistake. The camp contained mostly women, children, and elderly Apache who had been seeking shelter from the expanding war. The attack on the civilian camp caused outrage throughout the Apache Confederation and marked the end of any possibility for negotiated peace. Chief Nalnish declared total war against territorial forces, and Apache raids intensified dramatically across the entire region. The conflict had escalated beyond anyone's ability to control or contain. McKenna learned about the camp massacre from Apache survivors who reached him with urgent warnings about military movements in his area. Their descriptions of the violence convinced him that remaining neutral was no longer possible. He made the difficult decision to openly join Chief Nalnish's forces, bringing with him valuable intelligence about territorial military plans. His defection to the Apache side became a powerful propaganda tool for both sides. Chief Nalnish used McKenna's presence to demonstrate that the Apache cause was just enough to attract white supporters, while territorial authorities pointed to his treason as evidence of Apache influence corrupting loyal citizens. The war continued for 3 brutal years, with neither side able to achieve decisive victory. Apache forces controlled much of the mountainous territory and continued their effective guerrilla campaign, but they lacked the resources for sustained offensive operations. Territorial forces held the major settlements and supply routes, but could never eliminate the Apache threat. The conflict finally ended through exhaustion rather than victory. The American Civil War had drawn away many of the troops originally committed to fighting the Apache, while repeated crop failures and disease outbreaks weakened Apache communities. Both sides grudgingly accepted a negotiated settlement that established Apache reservations while guaranteeing an end to slave tow raiding. Chief Nalnish survived the war and lived to see his daughters grow into respected leaders within their communities. Ayanna became a skilled diplomat who helped negotiate treaties between Apache bands and territorial authorities, while Itzel became a renowned medicine woman whose healing practices incorporated both traditional Apache methods and medical knowledge gained during her captivity. McKenna remained with the Apache for the rest of his life, becoming an adopted member of Chief Nalnish's band and serving as an interpreter and cultural mediator. He married an Apache woman and raised children who grew up bilingual and bicultural, able to navigate both Apache and white societies with equal skill. The cave where McKenna first discovered the sisters became a sacred site for the Apache, who built a small shrine there to commemorate the rescue that had sparked their most successful resistance movement. Tribal stories celebrated McKenna's courage and Chief Nalnish's wisdom, preserving the memory of how a simple act of human kindness had changed the course of Southwestern history. In his later years, McKenna often reflected on the unexpected consequences of his decision to help two frightened children. His rescue of Ayanna and Itzel had indeed triggered a war, but it had also demonstrated the possibility of understanding and cooperation between peoples who seemed destined for conflict. The war had been brutal and costly, but it had ultimately led to agreements that protected Apache communities from the worst excesses of territorial expansion. The story of the Apache sisters and their rescue became a legend that was told and retold throughout the Southwest, inspiring future generations to believe that individual acts of courage and compassion could indeed change the world, even when their immediate consequences seemed to lead only to conflict and suffering.